interest in negotiating, concluding preferential trade agreements seems not to have waned despite the global economic crisis. Based on the latest figures that we have compiled in the report, there are around 300 agreements, whether notified or non-notified, currently in force on this planet, and there are a few dozens more under negotiations.
On average, each of our 153 members is signatory to 13 PTAs. I was quite shocked when I heard this figure for the first time, because that really talks to a web of criss-crossing agreements and raises real questions about whether this is the best way of doing business.
In the case of the Southern African region, the Southern African Customs Union evolved out of the historical, economic, geographic realities. From an economic point of view, it was very important for these countries to cooperate for improved market access, for enhanced flows of goods in the region. It became necessary. The essential reason for starting this was the recognition that without this integration, there can be no development.
Many believe the current of impasse in global trade talks may provide fuel for more agreements to be negotiated in the future.
I think the increase in preferential trade agreements over the years is partly, to be frank, in frustration with the slow pace of negotiations at the WTO. And I think particularly that's relevant for smaller developing economies like ours, and probably least developed economies in general, where they've perhaps found preferential trade arrangements a more expedient way to start creating a process of integration. And I think in our region as well, where you have a lot of very small economies, preferential trade agreements are really a little bit more accessible and a little bit more manageable than what can be a very slow and difficult accession process within the WTO.
About half PTAs are intra-regional and half across-regional. The growing tendency has been towards cross-regional agreements.
The level of intra-regional trade is quite small, and that reflects a lot of non-tariff barriers to trade. One key factor is the fact that transportation between the islands is extremely expensive. It can be a lot cheaper to send goods to Australia or New Zealand than to send goods between the islands. And that means your inter-regional trade is very limited. I think the other problem is that there is not a very diverse set of products in the region. And many countries are producing the same products, so the opportunities for inter-regional trade are not significant.
PTAs are less about tariff preferences than we thought, and more than we thought about regulatory measures that were once considered the domain of national rather than international trade policy. This change has occurred partly because of changes in the way production is now being organized internationally with the rise of global production networks.
We need infrastructure development, cross-border infrastructure development. We need to be able to, as I indicated, to have institutions, strong institutions. We need to be able to create capacity. But much more importantly, we also need to be able to set up, ensure that the administration of these trade agreements are in line with the broader global multilateral requirements under the WTO.
In a nutshell, the new challenge posed by these deep preferential trade agreements, the multilateral trading system, is one of market segmentation, because regulatory systems, which can become divergent, have now more importance on trade flows than classical tariff barriers.
I don't think we should forget that there are potential synergies between PTAs and the multilateral trading system. One is that some of these provisions that are worked on in a PTA context lend themselves naturally to treatment, MFN treatment. We sort of refer to this as the MFN dividend. If you do something on trade facilitation within your PTA, you're hardly likely to say, I'm going to unfacilitate trade with you because you're not part of my PTA. So there's an MFN dividend in that sense. There are some mechanisms in some of these which also have the effect of spreading integration. Non-party MFN clauses, for example, and docking provisions.
We could accelerate multilateral trade opening through a more ambitious regulatory agenda, I mean a multilateral one, and this would probably prove a very effective means of reducing the scope for divergence between the multilateral and the preferential trade opening.
Islands are an area that still need to be addressed, they still need to be looked at in detail, and they've got their own set of unique challenges, the costs of this distance transportation being one of them. So I think we need to do a lot more in that area, and I think that's a really important role that Aid for Trade will have in the coming years.